This episode of Tempo Talks was sponsored in part by Fur Planet Productions, publishers of hundreds of anthropomorphic titles, including My Six's Wild and Windfall series. Check them out at furplanet.com. Welcome to another episode of Tempo Talks on Culturally Apt. I'm your host, Tempo, and today we're going to be talking with Sarah Granke. She's the creator of the Birds and the Bees Sexual Violence Prevention animated shorts. Could you introduce yourself and what you do?
Yeah, my name is Sarah Granke, and I work with the province of Nova Scotia in programming and policy, and I specifically work in the area of sexual violence prevention and response. But in the past, I've also worked as a sexual health educator in high schools, and then I've also been a counselor for folks who've been sexually assaulted.
So how did this get started? Like, how did the Birds and the Bees media initiative, how did you guys start on that? Like, was that something internal to you guys? Was that like with the studio?
Yeah, so how it started, so I'll back up a few years. So in 2014, Nova Scotia launched its first ever sexual violence strategy. And to create that, we actually talked with hundreds of Nova Scotians, and we heard from a lot of young people about what we needed to focus on. And one of the many things that came forward and became one of our key actions was to create a public awareness campaign. And youth were telling us that it really needed to focus on issues of consent. So that's what we did. And so we connected with Arrivals and Departures, which is a local advertising company, as well as we created a provincial committee. And then we also worked with high school students all throughout the development process. I'd say it took us about a year and a half to get from beginning to end, but I think it was pretty darn successful, and something that folks are using all across the province and as well as outside of the province too.
Yeah, like I just came back from Anthrocon, which is like one of the two largest furry conventions, and like I have people play it on like in mixes of furry videos and things in the lobby. Like I swear, and that's in like Pittsburgh. So like,
what?
I've also like I talked to I've had people show it to me who live in like South Africa. I've had like, because like I'm like a furry novelist. I write a bunch of things with talking animal people.
Yes, I discovered. I Googled you.
Good. And so I've been shown it a number of times from all over. Like I had some people from South America show it to me. I had some people from South Africa show it to me. And but yeah, like one thing that strikes me about it is it's a significant departure from the standard, like, traditional model of how we do sexual education videos, which is that you guys talked to young people and people with experiences instead of just having it be a message for a pre-made message from on high. We are the old educational model of just like pouring information out into the empty vessels that that are students. So I think that is definitely something that's why I think it resonated. Like,
yeah, I appreciate that you picked up on that, because that's something we talked a lot about with how do we create content, not just an advertisement, not just a message that's being crammed into people's brains, but how do we actually make it to be something people want to watch? And we had people afterwards say, "Oh, when's the next one coming out? Like, when's the next episode?" And especially when there's, I mean, you well know this, but there's so much media and so many advertisements that people are bombarded with every day long. So how do you try and cut through that noise and create something that people actually might want to watch, and that's not so preachy either? So that's what we were hoping for.
Yeah, and I think when I have teenage students in my classes, because I teach at the local college, but like kids, like younger kids can opt in, and like that's definitely something they're really sensitive to, is like, is this something that I am actually going to find that is on my wavelength? You've brought it to you're speaking my language, as opposed to just like being another aloof adult telling me how to act.
Yeah, exactly.
Stuff like that. Did Jeff Simpson with Arrivals and Departures, did he pick the talking animal theme, or did you guys kind of have an idea, or?
Yeah, so we actually went through a whole lot of ideas. And by that, I mean, they came up with a whole lot of ideas, and our committee kind of vetted them and or said no, or actually we would present the concepts to the high school students and they were like, oh gosh, no, don't, well, they didn't say gosh, but
gee
no,
golly.
oh golly gee, no way. So
People are kids are very polite in Nova Scotia.
Oh, they really
they are. They don't use any curse words.
Never. We've eradicated sailor language.
Good.
Here on
That's good.
No, so we actually had a whole bunch of different ideas that Arrivals and Departures shared with us, that the youth looked at and vetted, and the committee looked at and vetted, and actually we'd come up with one concept, and then in December, right before we were all going on break, it got kibosh. Like, we just tossed it out, and they came back in the new year with a brand new idea we'd never seen, and it was this one.
Cool.
And we kind of said, holy, I think this is it. And we share it with the high school students, and we're like, cool. And that was basically the only response. Like, oh yeah, cool. I can see how this could go. This is funny. And I think one of the things that a whole bunch of us really liked was that, one, it's different than how we have done, and I mean collectively, we have done this kind of public awareness messaging before, but also, and especially I thought it was interesting, especially high school boys really liked that it used humor, because it made it easier to talk about. And so when you have those animal characters, and it's animated, you can kind of get away with a little bit more than what you might be able to if you weren't using, if you were using human actors. And then also too, something that we really liked about it was that, there's only a few characters in each episode that actually talk. And so then you've got to cast them, right? And then that gets tricky. Like, who do we cast? What do they look like? And when you go with animals, it's a little easier for more people to be able to connect with those characters. And so we really wanted as many people as possible to be able to see themselves in those episodes, or see people they knew in those episodes.
Right. It gives it a neutral context. Like, unless I'm able to really pick up on specific accents or something, I don't know that this person isn't from my same background, because I'm just hearing their voice and seeing a bird or a bee or something.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so you have a long background in like sex education and consent education. So why is humor useful?
But I think that people are uncomfortable talking about consent and sexual violence. I think that they're also really serious topics, and people don't really want to go there. And using humor, I think, breaks the tension. It breaks the ice and just makes it a little easier to spark those conversations.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm a big believer in the idea that you can joke about anything, you just have to do it right.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think it was John Cleese who was like, you can tell a joke about anything, you just have to be good at it. And because these are quite different from the sex ed videos that I ever saw as a teenager. Like, those were all like, those are so like cookie cutter that like you can make fun of them in TV shows because they're like they're made in the 50s and haven't been updated, and they're like kind of like the video quality is kind of bad now because they're copies of copies of copies, and they're like, just some guy talking about really vaguely and euphemistically. And one thing too that I noticed is that, and we'll get to this later, but to me it seems like a relatively new like development, a relatively new instance of progress within sex education to make consent its own thing within that. Because,
yeah, absolutely.
Right, like the biology of sex, okay, yeah, like you can look that up on, if you are a curious kid, you can just look that up on Wikipedia anytime. But like, like the idea of consent, since it's like requires a lot of like reading of social cues sometimes, and it's like there are context sensitivities, like is the person drinking, things like that.
Yeah.
Like there are a lot of complexities, and therefore it's harder to self-educate on, and therefore that is the sort of thing that really should be the focus of sex ed.
Absolutely. And like, we don't talk about that kind of emotional aspect of sex when it comes to sex ed, not very often, or like healthy relationships and what do those look like, and the importance of consent. It's one thing to talk about, the do's and don'ts, like here's how you can ask for consent, here's what the law says. Well, that's great, everybody can know what the law says, but if you don't care about it or you don't respect the person that you're hooking up with, then it's not actually going to matter. So how do we dive deeper and start unpacking ideas of masculinity and femininity and the construction of relationships and how we're supposed to be with one another? Well, supposed to, I mean, that's in quotations.
How can we can morally be?
Yeah. And that's the part that we don't talk about and we don't often equip young people with, or even older people with.
Right, because it's not just high school students who have sent this to me. In fact, I don't think any high school students have sent this to me. It's always been older adults who've sent this to me. But like, you're definitely speaking my language, because I write a lot of romance books and stories, and so I end up, my main product that I market is relationship porn, like good relationship porn. Like, oh wow, look how nice they are to each other. Like, look at their chemistry. Look at their, like, being helpful to each other. Because to me, it's one of those, like, you have to see it to be it kind of things. If you haven't seen, like, healthy relationships played out, whether that relationship is long-term or whether that relationship is like a hookup or something, if you haven't seen those played out, you just don't have the tools to do it.
How do you know? No, exactly. Don't know what it looks like. Don't know what it feels like.
And so, no, that's totally great. And I like that you hit on, like, kind of deconstructing notions of femininity and masculinity too, because those are often, we get a lot of our information about how we're supposed to, like, the social scripts we're supposed to be working from those things in our background. And those aren't perfect. Like, those don't always, what do you find is the most important part in your kind of, showing people what do you find is important about showing people this, you are acting this way because society tells you that you should because of your gender? Yeah,
I guess when I think about that, number one, a lot of times people are oblivious to the fact that we are even, that gender is even constructed, and that these gender roles and expectations and stereotypes even exist. So number one, it's about being critical, and then also looking at, being aware, being critical, noticing, and then, eventually, ideally, hopefully, we're getting to a place where people feel like they can break out of those molds a little bit more. When I think about it, gender norms, especially in regards to sex and sexual violence and consent, I think about how a lot of times in the media, it dictates kind of that men and masculine people should be more aggressive and pursue women and femme people. Things that say, that women need to be polite, passive, always ready for sex and sexual activity. Or that men are supposed to always want sex, like 24/7, and that they're entitled to women's bodies. It's everywhere around us all the time. And so how do we break out of that? And, it's not something that's just going to be good for women and girls, but, that can be really freeing for men and boys as well. And for folks all throughout the gender continuum. We hear so often, like, boys don't cry, you've got to man up, all of those kinds of things. And that really limits guys' expression or ability to be able to express themselves in, a whole host of different ways. And I think that when we can deconstruct and unpack and try and live our, it sounds so cheesy, but like our authentic selves with a whole range of options of how we want to be in the world, we're going to have healthier relationships. We're going to probably have much more satisfying and fun sexual encounters too. And that can help us to, like, get to a point where we have a little bit more respect for one another.
Right, because once you step outside of, like, once you become aware that this is a script you've been handed.
Yeah, and taught from day one.
Right. You get toys from the pink aisle or toys from the blue aisle and stuff like that. And, it's...
Oh, yeah, and even, like, I think about some stuff that, I'm not sure if you know Jean Kilbourne. She does a lot of work around media and advertising, and gender roles and sexual violence, a whole bunch of stuff. But, she was talking in a conference I was at about how she's seen clothes for kids, little girls, that say things on it like porn star. And we're talking like hypersexualization of children at this point, So it's 100%, you know, these are the toys for boys, these are the toys for girls. But then we're even starting to sexualize children at that very early age as well. So of course that's going to impact how we are in the world.
Right. And it even it reverberates out into non-sexual interactions, you know, too. Like, you have 99% of the time in your relationship you will not actually be engaged in sex, and so like you probably are talking to them too, and so like I hope
I'd love to hope so. Yeah,
hopefully you're just not just like, you know, like occasionally looking at each other, but like knowing that someone's experience is really different from yours, and like why you acting the way that you just assume you should, you know, the way that you have been trained to, might be a violation of someone else's rights.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like as a guy, like you get told like, well, you know, you got to put yourself out there, got to be assertive, got to whatever, you know, women like confidence, you know, whatever. And like, it's fine to be confident, but like, there's not really an upper like limit placed on that in, you know, in how guys are socialized. Like, and the reverse is kind of true for gals, like, you know, like, oh, be accommodating, come on, be polite, be, you know, whatever. And
exactly.
And so yeah, that's, once you're able to take yourself out of that context, it's kind of like on Star Trek where you have like the half black half white aliens who hate each other, and it's, you know, it's to just take it out of our context, which is another reason that like I think, you know, animation worked well here, you know, talking animal people worked well here, humor worked well here, like somewhat unreal situations, but like it's close enough to a real situation that you can still apply the context of your real life to it.
Absolutely. But, and you know what I think is interesting? Some of the high school students that we talked to after we had the launch of it actually came up to me afterwards and said, thank you, this stuff happens all the time. So apparently for some people, it's actually very real as well.
Yeah. So people like style wise, like just the show, like people have kind of compared it to, you know, it looks like BoJack Horseman and regular show and things like that, like kind of things that are out and about, like especially when this had come out, both those shows I think were still on the air.
Yeah.
So were those kind of the primary art style influences, like, because those are both shows that like teenagers kind of watch?
100%. Yeah, I remember. So I feel like this is where it's just like very obvious that I am not up to date on my pop culture, but I didn't even know what BoJack Horseman was when they. I think I'd seen an ad for it once online, but that was it. But that was the premise when Arrivals and Departures kind of pitched it to us. They were like, you know, kind of like this, and those were the images that they had, and they also had some pictures of like Futurama. And I mean, I think also even shows like Family Guy and The Simpsons. I mean, if you look at the very opening shot of that house party scene, like I kind of half expect that like Bart and Lisa are gonna walk out of the house.
It speaks the visual language of pop media.
Exactly. But then it subverts it, you know, like some of those shows, like I'm thinking Family Guy in particular, can be like pretty crass and offensive. So taking that kind of a medium and then subverting it and using it for a very different kind of message than is often portrayed in those shows, which I really like.
Yeah, because like Family Guy is probably the worst offender of the ones that are popular.
I would say.
Yeah, like I find that kind of show tends to get its humor, it plays at being subversive, but it's actually completely supportive of the status quo.
Yes.
Haha, how dare we show you this thing? Well, really, this thing is reinforcing what you already have been told your entire life about what you're supposed to think is funny, and how you're supposed to treat people, but you're not, because you're being polite. I think that given that we are at a time where there's such significant social change with like how you're supposed to behave online, and is that different from how you're supposed to behave in real life, and like you know, the Me Too movement and all these things about how we need to do more than just pay lip service to equality, things like that. The social rules are really changing, and media needs to keep in step with that, otherwise it's going to be as painful to watch as old racist cartoons.
Yeah.
In a few years. Now, I've seen these shorts shared online, like on social media, and like played in the lobbies at furry conventions multiple times. it's really hard to predict like what's gonna go viral. But did you guys like have kind of a suspicion of where this, that this was gonna be popular when you made it?
No, I think everyone probably always hopes that it's going to go viral or explode or become really popular and used all over the place. But I kept my hopes low, I guess. But through all of our consultation and testing of the different concepts, we really hope for a broad appeal. And because animation, especially animated animal characters, are being used, I would say, somewhat widely, we thought that maybe that would be a good hook, especially amongst the high school age folks and young adults. So it's also really great to hear that the shorts are resonating with furry fans as well.
So you were a little bit catering to furries.
I gotta tell you, I did not know that there was a furry community.
So it's been a learning experience for everyone.
It is. Or I think maybe I knew but didn't realize that's what it was called.
Right. So like a quick summary, like the furry fandom is basically like a meta fandom of other fandoms for like shows like BoJack Horseman and Regular Show and Zootopia and stuff like that. And so like the conventions that I was at Anthrocon signing books and things, and it was there. I think they had 8,000 people at it, and then we had later in the year Midwest Fur Fest is in Chicago, and that has about 10,000 people. There's there are a couple of ones. Toronto is like the hotspot for the furry fandom right now. There are like 4 or 5 different furry conventions there throughout the year. I was guest of honor at Camp Feral, which is one of the ones in Algonquin Park.
Cool.
Yeah, and so and really it's just like any other sci-fi fantasy Comic-Con
exactly.
thing. Yeah. So the My Little Pony fans go to our things. Like it's all just kind of one big thing. And it is actually one reason I wanted to talk about these shorts in particular is because not only is the fandom fairly it's full of fairly young people, like a lot of teenagers are in it, a lot of 20 somethings are in it, but also since it's all about within the fandom, it is a faux pas, no pun intended, if you don't have an animal that represents you, even just in a cursory way. And so since you use that as a constructed identity, it causes people to realize that they can reconstruct themselves in any way that they want, including in how they approach their relationships. And so you see a lot of people within the fandom who haven't had a lot of experience with relationships, but are using the context of online interactions and then eventually maybe meeting up in person as a way to test that safely. I am going to, and not even for hookups necessarily. I won't tell you no one hooks up at I'm not going to tell you no one hooks up at a convention, because I have been to archaeological conventions, and my God, people hook up
at all the different times,
right,
all the different places.
Right. And so because so much of this is online, and because you are expected to have a constructed personality, persona, it leaves people free to experiment a little more with how they're how assertive they're going to be, how respectful they're going to be, things like that. And I think that is part of why a guide like this resonated so well with furries, is because it speaks to the gives you more tools for approaching situations like this, because people generally want to be in relationships. People generally want to be in sexual relationships. And it's just a matter of, how do I actually get to that point? That's why I think the furries picked up on it so much. Yeah, and now we're here. Another thing that struck me about this was that popular media, sitcoms and things, present the birds and the bees as the talk. You have one talk, and then everything about sex,
obviously,
and relationships. Right. That they never show it either. But it must be really good, because then that character never has any other questions
ever.
They build it up into this one single supremely awkward moment, finding out Santa Claus isn't real. And at most we might get some gag about how oh, now this person had to take sex, this young character had to take sex ed, and then you're done. Good luck. And in reality, we are constantly learning new things about sex and our sexualities and that throughout our lives, like not just when we're young. And so so from the jokes to the art style to the situations, these shorts are clearly made for like high school, maybe college age people. So like, what are the benefits of making that? And yet, like, I've seen this like shared by a bunch of people who are in their 40s and whatever, and who are spreading this around. So clearly, it's not just something that young people are showing other young people. So like, what are the benefits of making sexual education material for adults?
That's a great question. And as far as consent goes, and we kind of talked about this earlier, but some people have never had these kinds of conversations and some people have never even heard of the concept of consent or don't really even know what it means. And we heard a lot about that when we were doing community engagement in Nova Scotia. A lot of people saying, I don't know what it is, no one's ever talked about it, or having very different understandings of what it is. So number one, just starting to have those conversations. But number two, I think it's great to have something that resonates with adults as well, because as you said, the conversation's ongoing. It's not a one-time event. We need to be talking about sex and sexuality, consent, healthy relationships all throughout our lives. Also, I mean, sexual violence is really normalized. And when we are bombarded with these kinds of images or ideas of what sex is, and often it can be extremely disrespectful, or it's not even sex, it's sexual violence is what it is. When that becomes normalized, we have to constantly challenge that status quo if we're gonna change the culture we live in. Now, I mean, like, I know that these two kinds of videos aren't going to solve all the problems in the world, but sparking those conversations, getting people to think, getting people to try and reshape the way they approach relationships as well. I mean, a benefit too for adults watching these. There are lots of adults that have children and or have young people in their lives. And so how do we have those conversations with the young people in our lives as well? And from an early age, right? We can talk about consent from the time someone's like 2 years old. I've often heard somebody say things like, go give Uncle Joe a hug or go give Grammy a kiss on the cheek. But we don't necessarily even ask if kids want to do that. And so how do we start talking about bodily autonomy and consent and respecting people's decisions on what they want to do with their body or not from a very early age? And we can do that in an age appropriate way. Now, I know these videos didn't focus on that aspect, but I think that's one of the great reasons why we need to be having these kinds of conversations with people of all ages.
Right. And that's a great way to put it too, because like this isn't really just about sexual activity per se. Like, this is also about like power dynamics within society. And
that's really what it comes down to. I think it's about, how do we, number one, respect or ask someone what they're into? And that can be an everyday kind of thing. It doesn't have to be sex, right? It could be, hey, is it okay if I give you a hug? I mean, yeah, that's a physical contact, but it's not necessarily a sexual thing. Then listening to what someone says and respecting that decision. And that's so much of what it comes down to. And when we're not asking, we're not listening or respecting somebody's choice, that's what it comes down to, really, I think, is about that power, that control, and whether or not we have respect for someone else.
Right. And we don't think of it in those terms oftentimes. We think of it in terms of like, yeah, I'm gonna score and whatever and things like that. Like, that was, when I was in high school, like, that's how people talked about sex. Like, they were oh yeah, you're gonna hook up with so and so, like, whatever. And like, it wasn't really about like, do I actually respect you? Am I treating you like I would want to be treated in your shoes? Things like that. And like, going back to another thing you said was when people talk about, like, when I talk about consent or something, because like I teach I teach like a romance fiction class at the local college sometimes, and we'll talk about consent because like inevitably, like I've just learned to head this off at the pass so that no one writes like a really bad story for the class when it comes to consent. I'm just like, because I'm like, let's just head this off like day one. We'll just talk about it. And because it's great, because I'm usually younger than most of my students because it's a night class, and so like I'll be like, okay, so let's talk about consent in fiction a little bit, just so we can have this, not be problematic. And when I talk about consent, people are, my students tend to say, oh, I know all about that. Like, we're not going to have any weird rape scenes in my story. And I'm like, that's really only one end of a spectrum that we're talking about here. I feel like movies and TV shows tend to train us to think of consent in those terms, it's, and even when, there are realistic consequences emotionally for like rape in fiction, it's treated as the only kind of violation of consent that really matters in a fictional context. I find and so, whereas like hooking up with someone while you're drunk is like a go-to joke in sex comedies, followed by the character like waking up embarrassed and trying to remember who this is and whatever. And I'm like, that's not really, like, I would be quite alarmed by that situation were that to ever happen to me. What do you think of the limited spectrum of consent mattering within media?
Yeah. Well, a few things. I mean, number one, a lot of times people don't then know what even constitutes sexual violence. When I talk with, and of course this is broad strokes here, not all young people, but when I talk with young people, often, say, well, what is sexual violence? And basically what you're just saying right now, the kinds of responses that we get back are rape, sexual assault, date rape, kind of stops there. And then we start unpacking it and talking about it a little bit more. And then the girls start talking about, how they're getting like 1 million dick pics sent to them every day, and how that makes them feel really gross and violated, or how they're feeling pressure to send naked shots to other guys in the class, or we talk about getting their butt slapped in the hall, or young guys having rumors spread about their sexuality or their sexual orientation, whether or not it's true. So all these kinds of things impact, on a different level, like what people do and don't do, but then also being able to understand what's happening around them. It normalizes, and I think you've talked about this a lot, but, when we only see one type of example of sexual violence, or that's the only thing that gets considered or portrayed as sexual violence, then everything else becomes kind of standard. It's okay. It's the norm. That's just what happens. Boys will be boys. Suck it up. And I think that can be really harmful for everybody. And that again goes back to those kinds of gender norms and ideas. I think that also really contributes to stuff like rape myths or victim blaming. We talk about, the example that you gave of, drunk hookups. Well, a lot of times people who have been sexually assaulted get questions like, well, what were you wearing? And how much did you drink? And you were flirting with that person. And none of those things ever means somebody was asking for it. And yet those kinds of ideas and ways of treating people are still, we see it in the courts. We see it in movies. I've heard people in my life say those kinds of comments. So that also impacts, or this kind of narrow view of what is considered sexual violence can have those kinds of impacts as well.
And those sorts of things people consider as mitigating factors aren't considered mitigating factors for like theft or physical assault or something like that. Like, yeah, you were getting along fine with that guy, and then he stole your car. What's the problem?
Yeah, exactly. Like you guys went for coffee and then they punched you in the face. Clearly,
right, you were hanging out. Clearly you were into that. I don't know. And what we see in media, like, really does affect us. Like, I will admit that, I write about romance and sex for a living, and I totally am still have, like, a little bit of context blindness for, like, I've had things normalized to me. Like, the first time I heard the Katy Perry song Last Friday Night, I was just like, yeah. some like, disposable party, good time, harmless fun song. And, like, it was only when I saw the video that I really, like, sat down and processed it a little bit, and I was like, I think that's, like, probably not sending a great message. Like, I got so blackout drunk that I, like, hooked up with people, and, like, there's, like, some stranger in my bed, and all this stuff, and I'm like, okay. And like, it's only through finding those things, like finding those blind spots that we have, that we can correct them. So like when like one of the hardest things for me to learn about this has been not to be embarrassed when I'm wrong
Mm-hmm.
about.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great point. And I was thinking about this the other day about how very often too, and now I'm thinking about it from the other side, like, when somebody does say something that's not okay or that's harmful or, that's promoting rape culture, how do we approach those situations? And the, the older I get, the more I am realizing that being curious and having a bit of compassion can go a long way, not assuming that people are always just being a jerk face, right? Yeah, sometimes people are. And sometimes we're learning and we make mistakes. I mean, I'm certain that I have said things that are not cool. And trying to approach that from a learning experience and having a conversation as opposed to just shutting another person down, but using it as a learning opportunity.
Right, like nobody likes to find out that they've been a jerk. Like
No.
nobody, like that makes all of us defensive. But like one of the things that has been most productive for me in learning about sexuality and consent and about like sensitivity in general toward other people's situations has been not to take it as a personal attack when somebody's like, "Whoa, that's you should maybe reconsider how you're thinking about that." And
Yep.
especially when someone presents it imperfectly to you. Like if, I'm sure that if someone came in and said, "All right, we're going to pause the situation. No one's upset, but you need to like rewind and go back and say that better." Then
Mm-hmm.
I would be, that would be fine. But like in real life, people are just like mad if if you're a jerk accidentally, and it makes you defensive. And so that has been like, for me, one of the main things I've tried to kind of connect with in the current like cultural moment, like as a cis white male who's like
Mm-hmm.
I'm married to a woman. Like I am like pretty far into the what is considered normal. Like I can walk down the street and no one will really give me much of a look. And so I feel like having people talk about this like it is some sort of women's issue is really doing an injustice to men, because I feel a lot more comfortable talking to female friends and relatives about relationships for having had these conversations and saying like, okay, well, as a guy, it probably seems like this or whatever, like being aware of like what the social expectations are and like the social pressures for gals and things like that. Prior to that, like I just would have been like, oh, I don't know, that seems normal.
Mm-hmm.
But like just like the Katy Perry song where like in real life having sex with someone who's blackout drunk is a crime. Like,
Mm-hmm.
now since we see it and it's normalized all the time, like we just kind of have like a mental autocomplete. So like what are the biggest challenges for you in fighting that sort of mental autocorrect?
Yeah. I think some of the same themes that I've already been talking about, I really do think that gender norms is a huge component. And I mean, let me back up too and say that like sexual violence is a complex issue, and ideas about it are reinforced in so many different ways. I mean, we've already talked about a lot of them in the media, within families, with our friends, sports, the education system. There's a lot of really easy and good examples that we can pull out from the media normalizing a lack of consent and normalizing sexual violence. But yeah, again, I think the media reinforcing gender norms and expectations, not showing what healthy relationships are, messages we're getting from our family or from the education system. Girls being taught to, or not taught, well, yeah, I guess taught and encouraged to objectify themselves or obsess about their sex appeal and appearance, especially at really young ages. Or, that guys should want sex but avoid that kind of intimate connection.
Yeah.
We don't talk as much about things like values or capacity for connection or healthy relationships or love or those kinds of things. And then also, yeah, the rape myths and victim blaming that is just so pervasive. Again, I think that can have a really negative effect.
I think we should take this opportunity to like talk about a couple terms we've used just for listeners who might not know. So like by like rape myths, we mean things like, she should have said no, you should have fought it off your attacker, da, da, da.
Yeah, there should always be a big physical struggle, or people are wearing something that is sexy, or they asked for it.
Or that women often lie about rape for some abstract, I can't really think of a context in which your day would get a lot better because you accused someone falsely of sexual assault.
No, exactly, right? And most of the time, like, I think it's only 5% of the sexual assaults that happen actually even get reported to police.
Yeah.
So the fact that someone is even coming forward is like a huge deal. And I think like the number of reported cases is so tiny. And yet that's so often a default that people go to.
Right. And it's really weird because, again, if we compare this to other crimes, like even other crimes that are just in a situation where it's one person's word against another, we don't automatically assume that the victim is wrong in, like, a mugging.
Mm-hmm.
While he's lying, he didn't really get his wallet stolen, like...
Why was he walking home at night?
Yeah, what does he expect dressed like that? Exactly.
And so those rape myths, as you just clearly said, really end up blaming the victim, and putting the responsibility on that person's shoulders.
And when we talk about, the other term I wanted to cover was rape culture as propagated by media, because this is like a media analysis channel. So we're not saying that if you have ever found Family Guy funny, you are engaging in this necessarily. You just need to be aware what the media is normalizing you to.
Yeah, and I think we've been talking about rape culture most of this whole conversation, and that's things like constructing blackout drunk sex with somebody as just a fun night, as opposed to looking at what it actually is, and that would be sexual assault, right? So those kinds of things that make it normal, or that foster power imbalances and things like that, and that it's like it's all around us,
Right. Like, I mean, and it's been all around us forever. You can look at, like, Greek mythology, and liking Greek mythology doesn't mean you approve of the sexual violence in Greek mythology. It just means that you need to be aware of it, or it will seem normal to you.
Yeah, and how do we challenge those, and how do we have conversations about it, and how do we, and as content creators, try and produce something different and present a different kind of option.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important topic too. Like, as artists and writers and, musicians and anything else, like, when you are creating content, being aware of how other works have gone astray can not only help you avoid sending a bad message, but also can take you in new directions no one has covered, really.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so I write sappy romance novels, and so people come up to me and talk about how much they like the sappy romance in my sappy romance novels. But the thing that stands out to me that people say over and over is, I like that you show sex real. It feels realistic, and it feels genuine, and it feels like they like each other. And oftentimes people don't have the words to describe why they like that, because really, when we dig down, it's they like that there is consent. They like that there is communication and respect and trust and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that they're not used to thinking of a steamy romance novel in those terms.
No, because usually it's just not talked about. It's just they locked eyes from across the room, sparks flied, and suddenly they're tussling around in sheets.
Right.
And that's not how it goes.
That's not, no. Like,
that's not how it goes.
Now, another thing, too, is that, like, we talk about, like, sexual consent, sexual violence, and whatever. I think part of the problem is that people think of it as it has to be an act of physical violence to be a violation, when really we're saying, like, this is a whole spectrum of behavior, and you need to be aware of where, like, you going down this path. Going by statistics, it's not like strangers in dark alleys that are the main danger. It's like someone you know from school or work, or someone you flirted with at a party, or someone on social media who's, like, only a jerk online. And, there's this whole spectrum out there of, like, catchy pop tunes and, like, trashy romance novels or raunchy sex comedies. And we all like dumb things. Like, you can like the dumb catchy song, it's fine to give your brain
I mean, let's be
break.
real. I like Katy Perry's Friday Night song. I do.
Yeah, and that's fine. Like, I think that sometimes this gets put in the context of, people think of this as, oh, well, you're taking away all these fun things from me. And that's not really what we're saying. Like, it's just that if you never think about them, you're never going to give yourself the opportunity to define who you are, as opposed to letting others define you and how you act. By putting sexual violence exclusively in the realm of stuff that sends you to jail and stuff other people do because they're creeps, it becomes something that, like, by definition, like, we and our friends can't do. And so therefore we don't look for it. If you're looking for the stranger in a dark alley, you will not acknowledge these other behaviors. And so, like, you set up the guys in these shorts as just like someone who's in the social group. And I think that was really valuable because these are instances of sexual violence that we don't see presented a lot in fiction. What do you think? Like, if you could tell people some blind spots to watch out for in, like this, what would they be?
Yeah, I think about a lot of those. So you mentioned, like, the spectrum of sexual violence, right? So I think about some of those things that are at the other end of the continuum. So not the stuff that's none of it's great, but telling a rape joke, it does have a different impact than somebody being sexually assaulted, right? So there is a continuum, but and I say we broadly as a culture and society here in Canada, and North America, period, but we only look at things that are on that more extreme end of the spectrum. So we forget about other stuff that enables and contributes to a world where it's okay to, send someone a dick pic or to grab someone's butt without asking them. But some of the things that I think of that don't often get considered are stuff like telling rape jokes, or what the media has been referring to lately a lot as, like, locker room talk. So, like, a lot of dudes bonding about objectifying women's bodies, or about what they, what kind of hookup they had, or, just reducing usually women to body parts. We can even talk about things like the sexist ads in media. I saw this one ad for a high-end clothing company, and it was a picture of a woman who was basically tied up and laying on the ground, almost in nothing. And then there was a bunch of men standing around her, and it looked very looming. Like, what is that kind of support? And we're seeing these kinds of things all the time. Or stuff like catcalling, right?
Yeah.
Can't count the number of times I've had people holler at me, or being told to smile as a woman. Why don't you? Well, you should smile more, or show me a smile, or things like that. All those kinds of things that some of them might seem a little bit innocuous, especially something like, getting told to, smile more. That might seem like not a big deal, but those kinds of things all add up and contribute. Again, they contribute to a world where this kind of stuff is okay, or seen as okay, rather.
Right. Like, no one goes directly to committing physical assaults. Like, that's not, like, those things are built upon a foundation of catcalling and stuff like that, like objectifying. Like, that's what we really mean when we say, like, these things build a rape culture. Like, they without those, you would very likely not, you would have not nearly as much, like, physical sexual assault. And I think that kind of gets lost in the noise sometimes, where people are just, they don't want to talk about it because it's awkward, and so they're just like, oh, like, here are the social justice warriors are out, like, saying we can't tell off-color jokes, and my dad and my grandfather tell jokes like that, I'm going to tell jokes like that too. Yeah. And really, the problem, no one is being hurt per se by you saying, hey, you should smile more, but by engaging in behaviors, like, you have to, like, look at what you're really, like, the meta conversation you're having. Like, you have to say, like, what am I actually saying by saying that? I'm saying, I've decided that your appearance doesn't match with what I would like. Let's change that around. Let's change your emotional state. We're going to just kind of rewrite what you're doing right now into what I would like,
Exactly. That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, and then, like, once you are in the habit of doing that, it is that much easier to start doing that in sexual contexts.
Yep.
Because
exactly.
Then suddenly, well, I swear she was into it or whatever. Or she said, yeah, I'm pretty sure. Did she really, or were you just like rewriting what you wanted to have happen there?
Mm-hmm. Or did she not feel like she was able to say no for a whole bunch of reasons that we might not even know about?
Right, like everything from like the socialization stuff that we've talked about to like power dynamics to like, you know, the idea that like one thing that I've run into a few times is like with other romance novelists, they're like, well, they're in love, so they're just gonna like just like everything, the whole smorgasbord of sexual activity is now on the table. I'm like, well, slow down. Like, if they're not ready for specific things, that's fine. You can have like, why are you fast forwarding through all of this stuff? Like,
yeah, totally. But that links so well too to the idea that consent is not just a one-time thing. You don't just say, yeah, let's have sex, and then that means anything under the sun can happen, right? Consent is an ongoing experience. It's not just a contract sign on the dotted line, great, here we go, right? It's about that communication and what are you into, and do you want to try this, and sometimes the answer might be yes, and sometimes the answer might be no, and sometimes it might be maybe another time, or let's try, check in about that later.
yeah.
It's not just a yes and everything goes carte blanche.
And I think that that's what both like this is a silly conversation to have like both sides of, like, because really we're all on the same side. Like, no one really supports sexual violence, but like the people I run into who are more resistant, let's say, to this, to having these conversations, tend to worry that it will reduce sex to a contractual kind of like, do you consent? Like, there's that one consent app you can get for your phone. Oh my god! Like,
I didn't even know about that.
Yeah, there's some like consent app. Someone was showing me a video about it, and I'm like, that's not really the point. Like,
the purpose is being lost. It's about wanting to have a mutually pleasurable, fun, good time, and respecting the person.
Yeah, and so so I think that that's really the problem here, is that people who are resistant to having conversations about rape culture and consent and stuff like that are primarily worried that they are going to find themselves to be the bad guys, that they are going to find themselves, especially guys, because like we're the ones by and large, guys are the ones telling the rape jokes. By and large, guys are the ones catcalling.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I think guys are intimidated by this because they are afraid that they are going to turn out to be the bad guys. They're going to turn out to have contributed to horrible things happening, and they don't want to face that. And so therefore their instinct is to say, well, I just don't like that kind of progressive hippie talk about all this. Like, you're just taking away all my fun stuff. And then another part of this is, like, we're talking about the social aspect. Another part of these shorts is that it's always somebody, like a third party, stepping in to say, in matters of consent, like, whoa, okay, dude, I know that, something's up, whatever, like, you need to, like, reassess this situation, like, in all three instances across the two shorts. And so it's not like the consent problems that are happening around you are not none of your business. So, like,
really focuses on that bystander aspect, like how to not be a bystander.
Right, and, like, I think that's simply something we just don't have a social script for.
I think you're right.
Like, and when we talk about social scripts, really we're like, we have a social script in this society for how to order a pizza. You call up and you say, hi, I would like to order a pizza, even though that is the only reason people call that number.
Yep.
And then but you say it because that's the ritual that you go through to order a pizza. And the thing is, these things aren't static. We haven't always ordered pizzas over the phone, so someone had to invent that social script for it. And therefore, like, at the time, I'm sure there were all kinds of screw-ups and awkward conversations and whatever about how to order pizzas back in the day. But, like, now we are going through that same awkward thing for talking about consent and rape culture and stuff like that. And so we are going to have some awkward conversations as we as a society slowly learn how to talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
What are good techniques for how to jump in when you feel like a situation is headed somewhere dangerous? How does it vary depending on if your friend is the one acting without consent or is with somebody who is, like, what are just some, like, go-to ways? Like, do you often deflect the situation, like get them out of the situation? Do you get people to pause and examine the situation? Like, what are often the most effective ways?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I think that's one of the reasons that people say, I didn't do anything, is because I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do, is often. So we need to start talking about, well, then how do we do this, right? And you don't have to be a superhero with a cape on, right?
Right.
You can do something simple. So there's actually an organization in the States called RAIN, and they have a really great little guide that they talk about, and it stands for CARE. So 1, creating a distraction; 2, asking directly; 3, referring to an authority; or 4, enlist others. So I'll just give some examples. Talking about pizza. So a great distraction idea, right? You could just say something like cutting off the conversation, like, hey, let's go pizza, or let's go get some pizza. I'm super hungry. Or, like, this party sucks. Let's go somewhere else. And, that could be, a distraction could even be something as simple as like complimenting someone's shoes, just like interjecting, somebody else is here, somebody else is watching, I'm listening. Or, regardless of who you're trying to intervene with, or like if you're the friend of the person who might get hurt or the person who is maybe not acting with consent, you can distract either of them, right? Or just like interrupt the scene, period. And it doesn't have to be whatsoever about what's happening. It could be, oh, I really need your help, I left something outside. So trying to come up with some of those kinds of ideas. Or, even like start a game with the whole group if you're at a party. So, asking directly. You could also just ask somebody straight up, like, hey, are you okay? Did you come here with people? And I mean, you might want to do that, like, if the person leaves for a second. Because, we do also have to consider safety. Every situation is different. But there are ways to approach what could be a bad situation in a safe way. So, like, referring to authority. So that could even be something like, like
whoever's house it is.
Yeah, whoever's house it is, an RA. If you're at a bar, it could be the bartender or a different employee, but getting somebody else to kind of watch and know. And, if it's at a place like a bar, for example, they want to make sure that the people that are there are staying safe. So they'll usually step in too. And then the last one, the E, which is enlist others, right? Like, we know that it can be an intimidating thing or a nerve-wracking thing to approach a situation like that by yourself, right? So you can get someone else to do or to go in with you. That could be your friend. That could be that person's friend, right? Like, maybe you don't know that person really well, but they're besties across the room. So maybe go grab that person and get them, say, maybe it'd be a good plan to check on them. They've had a lot to drink, or I'm worried about what's happening. So getting somebody else as well to be involved in the situation. So I think those are some, I want to say simple, but I know it's a lot. It's not actually that simple in the doing it, but some general ideas of what people could do.
And I think an important point you hit on is your relative power in that situation. So, like, if you don't have the social capital for whatever reason in that situation to, like, derail a dangerous situation, the characters in the shorts are saying, like, they're being pretty direct, like, they're being pretty gutsy, which is, like, actually the hardest thing to do.
Oh, exactly. We kind of went to the far extreme and just said, let's just go all the way.
Right. Like, the characters in these shorts are, like, knocking it out of the park for how you can handle this. They're not beating around the bush at all. Like, but you can totally be like, whoa, hey, like, been looking for you. Where'd you go? Da-da-da. Come on, I gotta show you a thing. Like,
yeah, exactly. Like in that first house party scenario, like, he actually goes up and he's like, no, man, you can't do this. What's up? Not cool. He could have just been like, yo, Carl, I need you to help me with something in the kitchen. Right.
Right. And suddenly the situation would have been completely derailed. But, like, for the purposes of giving us a social script, these videos are very important because they show us very directly how to just be like, head on, we're doing this. Like, hey, man, I'm going to talk to you about this right here in front of other people.
Yeah.
Like,
sometimes sorry, I'm just going to jump in for a second, but that's a really critical thing too, right? Like, when we're talking with our friends, sometimes having those conversations are actually better to have later, especially if people are trashed or just drinking at all, not in front of other people. We know that, like, we are humans, we get defensive. So how do we maybe want to have that actual really important conversation at a different point in time? But in that moment, just trying to diffuse the situation.
Right. And, like, thinking of this as a series of events that you can derail at various points.
Exactly.
You know, ideally we want to head this all off at the pass by like telling people how to interact better. But like we all make mistakes, whatever, like, and so having other people around to be a little bit of a safeguard and say, whoa, okay, like I know you're both pretty trashed, you know, let's do this. And then like as far as the power thing, like if you are in a situation where you, because of your sexual orientation or your gender or like whatever, you know, or your race or anything, like whatever it is, whatever has made you not powerful in this situation, there are still totally options. So like getting other people to come in to the situation and, you know, and like disrupt it, like lots of things will kill the mood for the person who's like behaving without respect for consent. Like there are tons of things that will derail this, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah. Including somebody who has more social capital.
Yeah, exactly. Like bring in, like, I think that's the appeal to authority one. What was the R?
Yeah, refer to an authority. And that authority doesn't have to be a police officer, right? That could be like the coolest kid at the party who everybody listens to.
Right. And that's not like, and even if that person isn't super well known for stepping in about matters of consent, having directed the Eye of Sauron of the party, like the social awkwardness now is focused firmly on this situation that is incorrect, can change, you know, like change the course of that.
Exactly.
So for all that like sex sells in pop cultures, like you mentioned, like a couple ads that are like inappropriate, that like are problematic because they present the lack of consent as sexy, and healthy depictions of consent are relatively rare. Do you think that's because like society is still uncomfortable with sex? Are there other reasons on top of that? Like,
yeah, well, I think number one, that's a component of it, and that it feels awkward and people worry. I mean, some of it is like people want to make money, and that at the bottom, like that's a big bottom line for a lot of folks. I also think, again, gender roles and expectations, power and control. And then I also think about too, like, well, who's making the movies? And, you know, if we look at who the vast majority of directors and producers are, for example, in Hollywood, you know, they're people with power, they're people with money. A lot of times not always, but most of the time, they're like wealthy, white, older men.
yeah.
And so how have those folks been raised in the world? And so a lot of times we just reproduce what we know and what we've been taught since we've been on the planet.
And when we think about like, oh, this new movie, like this must be, you know, really with the times and hip, but often those are made by like people who are fairly old and people who have had not a ton of reasons to change since they were young. And so now the entire second animated short is about online harassment. Honestly, I was really surprised by the direction it took. Like, I don't think I've ever seen a depiction of one character holding another character accountable for unsolicited sexual comments. Like, the comment itself wasn't even, like, the worst thing I've seen on the internet. And that's sort of the point. Like, that, you know, that, how can we explain to friends that somebody posting a picture of themselves isn't an invitation to discuss their sexual features or what we'd like to do with them? Like, how can we talk to friends about that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Right. We have to look at all the types of things, even the things that are quote unquote not that bad, right? Because those have an impact. And as we've talked about, those foster a culture where sexual assault and sexualized violence is normalized. So, you know, I think some of the things really are about having a conversation, trying not to shut the other person down. I mean, I know sometimes that's what we want to do because it can be really hurtful or harmful or offensive. And also that makes people really defensive. So how can we try and approach things with curiosity? How do we ask questions? You're like, where does that come from? Why do you think that's okay? Or, you know, have you thought about this aspect of it before? And also try to focus on the behavior, right? Because sometimes people say things without thinking about it and actually had no idea, right? So maybe they're not actually a jerk face. They just have never had the moment or opportunity to think about what that means or why it could be harmful.
They're just going on autopilot.
Yeah, exactly. And what everyone else does or what they see in movies. And, you know, this is a different situation. My grandpa once said something to me that was so racist. But truthfully, he just had no bloody idea because that is what the word everybody used when he was growing up. And so we had a conversation. I was like, oh my gosh, grandpa, here's why we can't use that word. And he was like, oh, I had no idea. And he wasn't trying to be a jerk. He wasn't trying to be racist. He just no one had ever told him that was actually inappropriate and rude and racist.
And I think that's the value of friends intervening with friends, because then you can use your, you can kind of leverage your friendship to say like, okay, hey man, I know you trust me, and I'm not just telling you this to make you feel bad. But
no,
like,
and I care about you.
Yeah, like I care about you. I want you to not at the very not even like go to jail, because most of these aren't go to jail sort of behaviors, but like I don't want people to think that you're a jerk. So I'm going to tell you, like, when you make this comment or when you say this, like, that's not okay, and here's why.
Exactly. And this is the type of impact it could actually have on somebody.
Right. And so, like, because if we take, like, the example of using, like, a racial slur or something, like, because that is on its own separate track in how our society is progressing, it's sometimes easier for us to see that. Like, you know, people are dropping the N-bomb. Be like, okay, well, you see how that would be like a problem, or like, I don't know, if you're making fun of gay people or something, like if you are, things like that. Like, it's sometimes easier to say like, okay, well, I know you think this is fine because you've seen it a bunch, but she just like you didn't choose to be Native or Black or whatever, she didn't choose to be a woman, so she isn't in control of that. So you behaving like this because this, she's a gal and she's around you, is on the same kind of track. So you need to, just like kind of like, oh yeah, we're gonna just check for each other. Like, if I ever did this, I'd want you to tell me whatever kind of things. Yep. And so I want to talk about people who are only jerks online and not real life. Because the internet is our real life now too. And like we talked about, society is trying to catch up on what it's okay to say. What are some good guidelines for what's a compliment and what's inappropriate?
Yeah. So I have to say I struggle with this question a little bit, and I think for me it's because it's not always about a do and a don't checklist, right? Like, because for one person it might be totally okay, for somebody else it might not be at all, right? It's not about being sensitive or not breaking the law. It really comes down to that, like that part about respect and integrity.
Right, like your best friend could come in and be like, "Whoa, you're looking hot," but like, some guy you barely know coming in and saying that would be weird and offensive.
Yeah, exactly. Like, really creep somebody out. I think too, something that I think about a lot, and in my own personal life as well, is that I struggle a lot about compliments, period, because so often they're about people's bodies and appearances. And as humans, we are so much more than just our bodies. We are multifaceted. So wouldn't it be really great if we actually started complimenting each other on things that weren't just about our bodies or our appearance, right? Like, hey, you are so smart, or that is so funny. You are such a hilarious person, or you're a really great friend. Those kind of compliments too, I find that they stick a lot longer anyhow, because they're not just about what someone looks like, but they're about who somebody is. So I would actually love to see a completely different kind of radical shift in how we compliment one another, period.
Yeah, and people often are less aware of non-physical things, like personality traits. Like, I am sure that the person who has great hair right now knows that. I am sure that he knows that shirt looks good or whatever. Like, that's probably on that person's radar. But like, taking like a little moment and like having a little, pause in the conversation and being like, I always appreciate how you're like this. So that's pretty cool. I like that. Things like that, where you can just say like, those sorts of things. I think you're right, do stick with people longer.
Yeah. And they're more meaningful. And let's be honest. Sometimes people look friggin' amazing and have like a great outfit or have a really cool new hairdo, and I actually do want to say something about it. And I often pause myself and I'm like, okay, wait, that person created this look. And that's how they want to present themselves to the world. So I try and change my compliment to be something more like, you have great style.
Yeah.
Because then it's about how that person is presenting themselves. It's not just that they bought a new shirt. It's not about the shirt. It's about how they are presenting themselves to the world. I think about purpose too, right? So what is the purpose in giving someone a compliment? So even if it is like, wow, you're really beautiful, but what is the purpose in telling them that? Like, what are you trying to get from that? Or what is it that you're wanting to convey? So thinking about that as well can help help with deciding what and where is appropriate.
And I find that, like, switching out who the person is helps too. Mm-hmm. Like, cool. Yeah. Would I compliment a guy in this situation? Or would I, you know, whatever, like, would I be like, and like, some of them are fine, like, especially, like, when it's what their intention is with how they are dressing. It is tough for me to think of a situation in which you being like, dude, I listen to that band too, is inappropriate. Like, that's just what they are signaling. So, when you're posting publicly, should you, I like to tell people, like, when you're posting publicly, you should just write it like your grandma's gonna read it. Like, she might, for all you know, like, but, like, do the rules change when these sorts of comments are public versus private versus instant messaging, things like that, like, with how many people can see them, essentially?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think the rules do change, but I also think that they shouldn't. Because again, it's the core principle here is respecting another human and making sure that the other person is okay with whatever's happening, right? Like, if you both said, yeah, we really like sexy talking, well, then go to town and have a really great little sexy chat. But
don't assume that that's fine.
Remember that our words have actions and they have an impact. And the only other thing I'll say here too is that, I know some grandmas who wouldn't get upset about certain things.
Right.
Don't always want to rely on all of our
Right. Someone might have, like, a really lewd grandmother out there who'd be fine with all this. Right? But, like, and honestly, like, it's just really what that is shorthand. Like, you could replace that with, like, your boss, your whatever.
Oh, totally.
Your significant other.
Is this something you would want to have published on the front page of a newspaper?
Yeah. And, like, that's often how I think people get themselves into trouble, is that they think, oh, it's on the internet, it's anonymous, whatever. I'm like, you're probably not as anonymous as you think.
And, and even if you are anonymous, what's
it's still terrible
that's happening on someone else?
Right. Like, or even people who just see it, who might not know that you and that other person talk like this, and then they may also join in and stuff like that. So, yeah. So, how do you think, like, given that we are having this cultural conversation now, how do you think the way we talk about sex and consent is changing in our society?
Yeah, well, number one, I think we're talking about sexual violence and consent in a very public way, and we have not done this before. I mean, this is, there's not more sexual violence now than there was before. People are just talking about it. They're speaking up about it. So I think that in and of itself is a huge change. I think as far as consent goes, we're talking a lot more about active consent. So not no means no, but rather that, like, yes means yes. So you actually need to hear it. You need to be engaged. It needs to be active. It needs to be ongoing. Not just that one time. She didn't say she didn't want it kind of conversation. I think there's also a lot more talk about accountability of people that are perpetrating sexual violence, accountability as far as, like, how do we as bystanders get involved to try and reduce sexual violence, and then also accountability to wider things like, media and pop culture, and how do we try and change that. And then I think there's also more conversation now than there has been about the need for everyone, men and boys especially, women and girls as well. We've talked about this before, but it often gets portrayed as a women's issue. But we actually need everyone to be involved to end sexual violence. And I think those are some of the big shifts that I've seen.
So what are the benefits to having everybody, have it be everybody's problem? Like, what are the benefits, like, individually, and what are the benefits to society?
Well, when I think about how it needs to be everybody's problem, like, number one, if we want to solve the problem, we can't just look at people who are being harmed. We can't just look at one aspect of the problem, right? We need to be looking at who's causing the harm and why. You talked about earlier how it is mostly men and boys perpetrating. And I mean, if you look at the stats, like, even when it's men and boys being sexually assaulted, more often than not, the person causing the harm is an adult man. And that is not to say that there are not women or gender fluid people who can cause it as well. We know that. So we also have to be looking at, why are so many men causing harm? Why are so many men hurting people and using sexual violence? And we need to be looking at that shift in cultural masculinity. We're not going to reduce sexual violence if only half the population is involved in ending it. What do I think could be some of the benefits? I mean, I think healthier relationships is a big one. More fulfilling relationships. I think there would be a lot less trauma.
Like, this isn't just like a thing we now need to do. Like, this is society progressing and us saying, like, okay, well, if you do this stuff, you will have healthier relationships and people will have fewer damaging experiences in their life that make it hard for them to have good relationships.
Yeah, and like seeing new ways of being as individuals and in relationships.
Right, because we're not like, because people often, like, when they are resistant to having these conversations, they often talk about, like, oh, well, you're taking away all these options I have. I'm like, no, we're giving you lots more than you had before for how you can interact, for sexual relationships. Like, if you are acting like an enlightened 21st century person, you can, like, more openly communicate, and you can, like, say, okay, well, I'm going to acknowledge as a guy that I have feelings besides anger and horniness.
Exactly, right?
Yeah. Like,
you can have a much more broad continuum of feelings, and you can express them.
Right.
Yep.
And so, talking about expression, so, like, just to wrap up, what would you like to say to writers, artists, musicians, animators out there about how to portray sex and consent?
Yeah, I mean, number one, let's show people talking about consent. Number one, period. That would be great. Even for something that might seem as simple as a kiss, it doesn't have to be a buzzkill. You can ask for, asking for a kiss can actually be really sweet or romantic or even like really hot. You don't have to, as I've said before, you don't have to pull out a piece of paper and ask someone to sign a legal contract. I want to see characters actually asking for consent, listening and respecting it. So for example, if one partner's like, no, I'm not really into that, let's not see the other person pushing them further or nagging them. How about just like, okay, cool. How about we have some popcorn and watch a movie? Or just like snug on the couch instead. And if characters do decide to have sex, I'd really like to see them checking in with each other throughout. It's not that one-time deal. It's about that solid communication. Can look like a lot of things, right? Like, are you into this? What do you want to do next? Want me to keep going? No, I would just like to see it not making a joke out of it. I'd like to see healthy relationships. And I'd really love to see mutually enjoyable and pleasurable sexual encounters for everybody that is involved in said sexual encounter.
Because that's really what we're talking about, too. Like, it's like, we're saying, like, okay, cool, like, by having this open communication, you are going to have more and better sex. Like, by communicating what you want and, like, when people are in the mood and, like, things like that, it is you are going to have a better sex life. This is not, like, an impediment. This is a bonus.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Talk to your partner.
For you and your partner or partners.
Yeah. And so, like, really, like, that to me is, like, the heart of the issue is, like, we're not telling everybody, we're not coming in and being prudes about this. We're not coming in and telling people, like, oh, well, we can't talk that way. We're saying, like, if you aren't so scared of sex, you will have better sex. Because the reason we don't show characters in fiction communicating during sex or, like, talking about sex after the fact and what they liked and what they didn't is because the authors were squeamish.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is because they didn't have a script to do so. And so then we instead just see, like, a vague montage if it's a movie or something, and then we're done, and they're like, oh, wow, cool. And I'm like, but did you guys, that wasn't super hot, guys. That was, like, just a vague, like, oh, and then we did things but didn't show you. And I'm like, in the media that I have seen that portrays sex more realistically, where you're communicating and stuff like that, and like, the conversations around it, and, like, what you like and what you don't like and stuff like that, that's far more engaging and realistic and leads to better and more adventurous sex than just, like, are you willing at all to actually touch me? You know, like, 'cause that's kind of the thing. Like, oh, well, are you in the mood to, are you in the mood? Like, it's like in like a sitcom, it would be like, oh, are you in the mood at all, honey? And she'd be like, no. Well, like, you didn't actually ask what she was in the mood to do. So, like, there are plenty of things you could do, and maybe one of those things on that menu she would have been up for. But
never know if you don't talk about it.
Right, like, if you never talk about it, and instead you just, like, assume that, you have been rejected. And, like, again, like, I feel that, like, the fear of rejection is part of this, too. Like, well, I don't want to have to talk about this because I fear being rejected. I'm like,
oh, for sure. Yeah.
right, if you present this as, like, an ongoing communication about, like, when and where and what you want to do, then you will end up having, if more sex is your goal, this is the way to do it.
Yeah. And also, too, just to that last point there, like, you know what? Rejection happens. It's a part of life, and that's also okay.
Yeah. Like, it doesn't have any, it does not say anything about your your value as a person, that a particular person didn't want to have sex with you at that particular moment, because we are all complex, and we all have stuff going on, and maybe that person's, aunt died yesterday, and they just aren't in, or whatever, and they just aren't in the mood, so maybe you should just leave them alone. Like, it's not anything, oftentimes it's not anything about you. And
most
even if
of the time.
Right, or even if they end up with someone else at the party or whatever, don't feel insulted because maybe you look too much like their cousin. Who knows? Like, do not feel like that people are complex. It is not, you are not the center of the universe. They don't know. And so being more at peace with this tends to also make you more appealing to others.
Yep.
Because nobody likes to be with somebody who's a jerk and who's feeling angry that they get rejected and things like that. That's not, people don't dig that.
Yeah. I think the other thing I'd like to see, too, is deeper portrayals of relationships. This is not me being a prude, but there's also so much more to relationships than sex, too. Like, yeah, absolutely, that is a component of many romantic relationships. And there's lots more, too. And there, intimacy can look like a lot of different things as well.
And just on a side note, like, I really appreciate that you guys are out there doing this and putting so much thought into this, because, like, this is definitely something that we need to, like, address as a society. And, like, I know that, you mentioned it's one video or two, one video series isn't going to change this, but, like, every raindrop raises the sea. Like, this is bigger than any of us. And
exactly.
So,
we need to do all the things.
Right. And so, like, having these conversations does change society. It's just, society is so large that it's hard for us to see our own impact. So, like, I really just wanted to, like, acknowledge that it's super cool that you guys are, like, taking this so seriously and making this, and ironically also making this fun, like, also making this funny. But
trying.
Yeah. And so, like, it's as funny as we would want it.
Yeah, well, that's it. That's
right.
There's a balance. Cool.
So, but yeah, anyway, awesome. Well, thank you so much. And thank you in the audience for joining us. And until next time, remember that we all have the power to change the world, even if it's only a little bit at a time. I'm your host, Tempo, and this has been Tempo Talks.